Well, good day. I want to talk to you about structured employment interviews and employment interviewing in general. So let's kind of get started, and we'll cover a few basics. First of all, we need to remind ourselves of the distinction between structured versus unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews, you've experienced those. That's where somebody's interviewing you for a job, but they don't appear to have any structure. They don't seem to have written out the questions in advance. They don't seem to have any scoring guides. They seem to just be kind of asking you questions based on what your last answer was, whatever pops into their head. So there's no structure. These are called unstructured. And structured interviews, the questions are planned in advance. There are ways to score people's answers, and there's a very systematic approach to doing it. And we're going to be talking in today's session about these very structured approaches to doing employment interviews. And all the research suggests that structured interviews are more valid, that is to say they are better predictors of job performance than are unstructured interviews. As you can see here, the validities for unstructured interviews are relatively modest, typically in the vicinity of 0.14 to 0.33. But the validities for structured interviews are higher, from about 0.35 to 0.62, and those are much more impressive validities, again telling us that these structured interviews are better predictors of job performance than unstructured interviews, and that's why we want to be using them. Okay, let me talk about the basic components of structured interviews, and there are going to be three big ones, and this is the first of those big three. All the questions in a structured interview are based on a study of the job. That is, somebody examined the job, did a job analysis, and each question is linked to an important task or activity or some important knowledge, skill, or ability or characteristic that's required to perform the job. So again, think of a job analysis, a job description, and each question in these structured interviews is linked directly to one of those important features of the job. That's number one. We did a job study. One particular technique is called a critical incident. And in a critical incident, we try to identify some of the behaviors that distinguish somebody who's excellent from somebody who's merely average or even poor on the job. And one way to do that is to ask these two questions, right? I could go and before I design my interview at all, I could go out and talk to employees, and I could talk to supervisors of the job, and I could say, hey, tell me about a time when you saw someone perform this activity or this skill very effectively. What was the situation, and what exactly did that person do? I could ask the reverse as well. Tell me about a time when you saw someone perform this activity or this skill very ineffectively. What was the situation? What exactly did they do? And if we collect lots of examples like these are examples are referred to as critical incidents, and these examples are great ways to create questions for employment interviews. And we learn a lot about the job and what distinguishes excellent from mediocre performance. And of course, what we're looking for is excellent performance. And this critical incident job analysis technique can really help us identify that. The second big feature of structured interviews is that we're going to ask the exact same questions of each candidate. Everybody gets asked the same questions. You can think of the interview as merely a test, and it should be standardized. Everybody should get the same questions on this test, just as you would expect that everybody in the class would get the same questions on a test that I administer in a course. So everybody's going to get asked the same question, and we should have some uniform way of scoring answers. When we ask questions, because we want everybody to be asked the same questions, we don't want to do a lot of follow-up questioning. We ask our question, And we can use very simple probes to generate more information. Could you provide an example, or can you explain that a bit further? But that's all we do. We don't want to go any further, because if we go much further, then what you find is that each candidate isn't really experiencing the same interview. So we want to ask each candidate the same question and use very short, simple, neutral probes. Hey, can you give me an example? Can you explain that a bit? That's it. We're going to talk about 3 different types of structured interview questions: situational questions, past behavior questions, and knowledge questions. We'll go through some examples of those in a bit. In general, it's good to use a longer interview rather than a short interview. Now, there's no need to conduct an interview for the most part that lasts more than an hour. But very, very brief interviews are generally not helpful. You just don't have enough time to gather enough information about the candidate. So 30 minutes seems to be a reasonable target, maybe 45 minutes, but certainly no more than 60. Again, you don't want to ask just a couple of questions and be done with it in 5 minutes. It'd be like me administering an exam in class and only asking 2 questions. That's probably unfair, because you might or might not know those 2 questions, but I get a much better gauge of what you know if I asked a larger number of questions, like 10, 15, 20, or 30 questions. So same kind of concept with the interview. Generally, when you're conducting an employment interview, it's good to not have too much ancillary information. Imagine you have a company that administers a test and as part of their pre-screening process. It's best if the interviewer doesn't know the test score at the time of doing the interview. Or imagine the company requests copies of the candidate's transcripts from a university. It's best if the interviewer doesn't know what's on those transcripts. Later on, you can look at that information, but you don't want to know that information before the interview, because it can kind of bias both the verbal behavior and the nonverbal behavior of the interviewer, and that's not a good thing. The general rule is to not allow the candidate to ask questions until after the interview is done. Okay? So don't provide the candidate at the beginning with any detailed information about the job or the specific knowledge, skills, abilities, or other characteristics you're looking for. Because once the candidate knows those things, they're likely to kind of tailor or distort their responses to give you an answer that is what you're looking for, at least in their opinion. That is, they might be faking. The third big thing is, remember the first 2 were, we did a job study, so all the questions are going to be based on a job study. Each candidate is going to be asked the exact same set of questions. And our third is that we're going to have a scoring guide that we can use to evaluate candidates' answers to each question. And we're going to create that scoring guide in advance. So it's kind of, we've decided in advance, here's what we consider to be a good answer to this question. Here's an okay answer to this question. Here's a poor answer to this question. And we're going to have that scoring guide for each one of the questions, and we're going to have it in advance. So when the interview is done, we can score the interview, we can score the person's responses in a very systematic and fair manner. And generally the way we do that is we have what are called anchored rating scales, examples of what constitutes an excellent answer, an okay answer, or a marginal or poor answer. And we'll have some examples of those in just a bit. We should, during the interview, be taking detailed notes. That's important. And in the interview assignment where you'll be interviewing a candidate in this class, you should be taking detailed notes as the candidate talks. You don't want to rely on your memory. It's unlikely that you'll be able to remember all the details later on. So you want to make sure you've got paper there where you can take detailed, thorough notes. Your job here isn't so much to evaluate the candidate as they're speaking, but to be jotting down the key points that they made in answering the question. Sometimes it's advantageous to use multiple interviewers. This process is referred to as a panel interview, where there are several people asking the questions at the same time. And this panel of people later on then talks over the candidate's answers, goes through the scoring guide, and agrees on what an appropriate rating or score is for the candidate's answer to each question. So sometimes these panel interviews are helpful, sometimes they're not. The only downside could be is that sometimes when somebody's being interviewed by multiple people at the same time, they can feel very stressed. And therefore they don't kind of behave as they normally would in a situation, because they're really kind of stressed out by having too many people in the room. So more typically, if you're going to do a panel interview, you just want to do it maybe with 2, 3, or 4 people in the room, not with 10 or 15. Where possible, you'd like to use the same interviewer or the same interviewers across all the candidates. So if you're going to interview 7 people for a job, it's really best if you can have the exact same interviewer or interviewers for all 7 candidates. Most companies, large corporations, provide pretty thorough or extensive interviewer training. I've done this for a number of companies in the past. And this kind of training isn't just listening to stuff, it's actually practicing how to ask the questions and how to score the questions and how to ask follow-up questions and prompts in an appropriate way. And people can often be video recorded as they do these things, and they can see themselves and get some feedback about what they're doing effectively and what they're not doing effectively. We always say in my field that it's best to use statistical rather than clinical prediction. That may sound confusing, but it's really pretty simple. The best way to score the candidate is simply to add up the points that the candidate received for the questions. So simply, if there's like 10 questions in the interview and each one of those questions was scored using your scoring guide, the candidate's score in the interview is the sum of the scores they received on the 10 items. That's simple. That's it. That's it. It's not a clinical thing. It's not like you're going, oh, I really like that person, or I didn't like that person, or my gut tells me this. All the evidence says that's not the best way to do it. The best way is to just ask each question, use your scoring guide to score that, the answer to that question, add up all those scores. That's the candidate's score in the interview. That way you can compare the candidate's score to the score that other candidates had, and your goal is to hire the one with the highest scores. So let's give you an example of one of our 3 types of questions. This is called a situational question, and this is a real question that a retail company used to use. It was as I recall, it was a jewelry store. So here's the question. Imagine you're applying for a job to work as a retail clerk in a jewelry store. And among the many questions they ask you this situational question. A customer comes into the store to pick up a watch he left for repair. The repair was supposed to have been completed a week ago, but the watch is not back yet from the repair shop. The customer is really angry. How would you handle that situation? So notice in that situational question that I asked, it's actually based on a study of the job. They had done a study. They found that these kinds of things, dealing with frustrated or angry customers, is an important feature of the job. And they actually used critical incidents, and they came up with an example of a question like this that often does occur. So they thought, well, let's ask how somebody might handle a situation like that. Now, I don't know how you think you'd answer that question, but let me show you the scoring guide that the company created. A poor response would be to tell the customer that the watch isn't back yet and ask the customer to check back later on. So on a 1 to 5 scale, if that's the answer that the candidate for the job gave to you in response to that question, you'd give them a low mark, like a 1. A more kind of typical okay response would be if the candidate says, well, I'd apologize. I tell the customer that I'll check into the problem and I'll call him or her back later. That's fine, good answer. But a really excellent answer here, a 5, would be if the candidate said, well, I think what I'd do is I'd first try to put the customer at ease, and then I'd call the repair shop right then while the customer's waiting. I'd check into the problem right then, find out what's going on, so I can get a good answer for the candidate, for the customer, and they'll know what's going to happen and how quickly we can solve this problem for them. So you can see the distinction between an average answer and what the company would have considered an excellent answer. And the average answer is fine, but the excellent answer goes a step further and takes care of the problem right then and gets the information right then while the customer is still there. So that's an example of a situational question. I'm going to skip to this and give you an example of a second kind of question. A second kind of question is called a past behavior question. And in these questions, instead of asking how somebody might handle some hypothetical situation, you ask them about something they've done in the past. You ask them a question that is asking them to describe their past behavior. This is based on the notion that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior in a similar situation. This question here is a past behavior question where this was an Ivy League university that was using an interview as part of their screening for candidates to the MBA program. And so in addition to test scores and transcripts and everything else, they had a structured interview that they used. And so here's an example. They wanted to understand what's called a results orientation. That's the kind of tendency to be very focused on obtaining meaningful results and things that really benefited a company. So all the candidates at this Ivy League college had at least 5 years of full-time professional work experience. So this was a past behavior question that was focused on trying to learn more about the candidate's results orientation. Of course, they didn't tell the candidate they were looking for results orientation, but here's the question they asked. Think back on your accomplishments at work during the past 1 or 2 years. Tell me about your finest hour. That is the project or the assignment when you had the most success and the greatest impact. So that's the past behavior question. Now, and then the candidate's free to start telling you about whatever comes to their mind about being their finest hour, where they were most successful, where they had the biggest impact. Now, if they don't say too much, you can ask some simple follow-up questions. Here are some follow-up questions you're permitted to ask. You know, what were the biggest obstacles you faced? How'd you keep things going as the project or assignment progressed? What was the impact on the organization or on other people? And how'd you measure that impact? So that's the past behavior question. So you're asking about real behavior that has occurred in the past. And I'm going to skip over some things here, give you an example of another past behavior question. This is for somebody applying for a market analyst position. And in particular here, this company has done a job study, and they know that that people in this job have to prepare reports to meet client deadlines, and they have to use information gathered from primary and secondary sources. So here's the question they asked. Again, it's a past behavior question. Describe a time when you had a deadline to meet, but realized you would not be able to meet it. What were the circumstances that led up to your realization? How'd you handle this situation? What was the outcome? What would you do differently the next time? So you let the candidate describe what actually happened. You can give them a prompt by asking some of the follow-up questions again, and you take notes about the candidate's response. And there's a scoring guide here. And so I won't go through the scoring guide in detail, but let's take a look at the a poor and an average and an excellent answer. In a poor answer, the applicant had to be prompted to answer the question. They gave numerous excuses for why the deadline was not met. They didn't take responsibility for their own role in missing the deadline, even though it was obvious that they had some role in that process. An average answer would be if the candidate described the situation in some detail. The answer indicates that the applicant realized that missing the deadline was a problem and that a better plan of action is needed in the future. And the applicant took responsibility for his or her role in missing that deadline. So that's okay. That's a fine answer. A really excellent answer is the candidate described the situation in detail. Lots of specifics about the incident and about how it was resolved. The candidate's answer indicated a strong ability to prioritize projects, and the applicant was willing to admit when things don't go as smoothly as planned. And now the applicant has a clear plan for how to avoid the same situation again. So that's an example, another example of a past behavior question. The final kind of question we want to talk about is called a knowledge question. This is where we're going to ask a question about a technical aspect of the job. Okay? So here we're talking about technical knowledge, about something the candidate will be expected to do in the job. And it's not just general knowledge, general behavior, it's technical. This is a question that a company that I did consulting with used as part of their screening process for programmers, for people who were being hired as computer science programmers. And the questions, you can see, very technical, focused. Now I'd like you to spend a few minutes telling me about any complex programming project or assignment you've worked on. This project could have taken place as part of a course or as a result of your work or some other experience. Now, it might take a few minutes to recall the details of that experience. That's okay, take your time. Now, tell me, what were the first steps you took when you initially began to work on this project? Or you could ask them, after you received or clarified the user's requirements, how'd you begin working on the project? And I'll give you an example of the scoring guide that this company used for this kind of very technical thing. So they said a low response would be the candidate immediately began coding, or the candidate had been exposed to some design techniques and courses, but hadn't really used them. An okay response was that the candidate used some detailed multi-step logical approach to design the program. For example, they might have used flowcharting or some other type of logical design method. An even better response would be that the candidate had used what are referred to as structure charts or pseudocode before they began writing code. And a really great response would be that the candidate routinely uses some top-down graphic or pictorial design tool and further refines that design with what's called pseudocode. And again, the person who's asking the questions understands what it means to be a programmer and listens to the candidate's response and decides whether it was low, medium, high, or very high. And again, the candidate would be asked a series of questions like this. That's kind of a brief introduction to the concept of structured interviewing, right? 3 main features to remember, right? We always base the questions on a study of the job. 2, everybody gets asked the same questions. And 3rd, there's a scoring guide for each question that we ask. Finally, we can use situational questions, past behavior questions, or knowledge questions. So I hope this has been helpful. And that's it for our session. Thanks for participating and listening.